The third annual Africa Leadership Forum, hosted by the Uongozi Institute in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, attracted several former African presidents and prime ministers, as well as academics and a range of African leaders from the public and private sectors. They were welcomed by former Tanzanian President, His Excellency Benjamin Mkapa. The theme this year being Enabling African Business to Transform the Continent.
As you know, we have an Agenda 2063 by the African Union, which sets the goal for 2063 of a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. Africa, which shall be a prosperous continent with means and resources to drive its own development, with sustainable and long-term stewardship of its vast natural resources, where its unique endowments, natural endowments, and its environment and ecosystems are healthy, valued, and protected. This is a very great ambition, but it's no more than a declaration. How we get there depends very much on how African people themselves take the challenge into their own hands. There's no doubt that we must address these key issues of building capacity in terms of ownership, entitlement, access, marketing, preferences, cooperation, and the labor force. These are all moved together in order to produce the pace of development that is sought and envisaged in Agenda 2063.
The keynote address was delivered by Uongozi, former president of the Chamber of Mines of South Africa and CEO of Exxaro Resources until March 31, 2016.
Business people are always accused of being solely driven by a profit motive. So you don't get into business if you don't want to make money. But the thrust of business that we talk about today is a business that is motivated to make a contribution for the benefit of the continent and her inhabitants. How do we ensure that business becomes a catalyst and an engine for transformation and transforming people's lives? If you walk around the continent and probably in other areas, people will tell you that Africa as a continent does not have a business that we could consider an African or African champions. So as we talk about transforming businesses, is that what we're looking for or not? This is the question that we need to talk about and think about. But the mere fact that we talk about business today suggests that we do have good and thriving businesses on the continent. Businesses that have made a mark in the lives of our people. Every serious analyst that you talk to or you see, be they economic or political, do acknowledge that an Africa of today is different and more savvier than an Africa of yesteryear, insofar as business is concerned. There's been massive growth, and if you read a lot, they say to you, you know, China has taken the world to a particular level, and now it is time for Africa. And Africa is the next big thing that is to happen in economic development around the world. Could we as the continent and as business do better? And do better than the rest of the world? And what stops us today from taking those steps such that we become leaders this century. How do we create an environment or conditions or an opportunity for African business to thrive such that they are more inclusive and can make an impact in people's lives, whilst at the same time instilling confidence to the African people? In other words, who should and how can we give African business legs to run and to dominate the world? Because we need just to be as competitive as possible, be nimble, we need legs to do that. So that's the definition of enabling that I've found. On transformation, here we talk about change, changing the existing environment, change African business such that they play a key role in various world markets, such that the world has no choice but to want to do business with Africa. In other words, we do things such that the world stands up and says, something is happening, and I need this, and where can I find it? It's in Africa, and I cannot find it anywhere else.
As an example of what can be done, Uongozi looked at the successful transformation achieved by Singapore. Singapore moved from a third world to a first world island city-state in a single generation, despite having no natural resources, by capitalizing on their location and their people. The government created an enabling environment in which business could thrive, and Singapore became an investment and technology hub, a link between Asia and the rest of the world. Another example of successful transformation was South Korea, with its 5-year economic development plan under the slogan, Modernization of the Fatherland. They focused on skilling people to drive innovation and technological development.
We need selfless leadership to make a change. Leadership will give a vision for growth and advancement of society. Leaders in business and leaders in government must have love for themselves. To be a good leader, you must love yourself first. The second thing, leaders in business and leaders in government need to have love and passion for their own people. If you don't have that, enablement of and transformation of economies may not just happen. The last thing that I want to add is that leaders in business and leaders in government need to have love for their own continent.
From the keynote, the plenary moved into a panel discussion covering topics ranging from enabling macroeconomic environments to the kind of leadership the continent needs to stability on the continent.
I want to begin with what perhaps is the most difficult question for Africa today. And before we go into business practice, finance, and the rest of it, we cannot have successful African businesses with instability. And there I want to begin. We are living in a very diverse Africa. Some states have achieved levels of democracy and good governance that are quite incredible and are leading in certain areas. Across the globe, you're seeing Rwanda doing so much, moving ahead, plowing ahead, and yet, not so far away, we have South Sudan. What is the problem? We are in a dynamic, diverse world where we cannot afford to continue doing the disservice to our citizens that some of our nation states seem to continue to uphold. How do we ensure that we have a safe and secure Africa and play a role in ensuring stability in some of these states? Franny, perhaps I'll start with you on that end.
When I visited Juba for the first time, our hotel was a container. That was the hotel that we had. There were no roads. When we traveled a little bit outside of Juba, you'd find these beautiful mangoes which sell for €5 a mango in Europe, just rotting on the ground because there's no transport to transport these mangoes from where they're falling from the trees to the markets. There are no industries that could make mango juice or mango jam, or even to slice. You buy now from the Philippines a packet of mangoes for 6 to 7 euros. If you're transiting through Johannesburg Airport, they sell some of these mangoes there. So that industry doesn't exist. So I think the enabling infrastructure, the skills, and the ability to transform resources into value that creates a higher quality of life for the people who are involved in the business, the access to finance that would allow those rural communities to be able to transform the environment in which they're in, very rich agricultural land. There's the oil, ability to extract that and sell into global markets that don't have too many fluctuations in commodity prices, which also have an impact. All of these issues could have helped South Sudan transform, but the fundamental starting point is peace and stability. And I think this is where I will stop, because I know that other panelists are much more involved in that process and would be able to comment more precisely on that.
When our keynote speaker, Sipo here, was speaking, President Kapa and myself were asking ourselves a question. It raises a very important point about leadership, and says these leaders must be people who love themselves and therefore don't want to be seen as having left a bad example. They must love their people. They must love their countries and continent. So we're discussing this brief, not discussing, we couldn't discuss, we had to listen to him carefully, but exchanging brief words with President Kapa as to where are these African leaders he's talking about? Who've got all of these lovely attributes. But you know, I do come back to the matter of Sudan, South Sudan. In December 2004, it was an important meeting of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the SPLM, in South Sudan, at a place called Rumbek. And they took copious minutes of the meeting. And because of it was an emergency meeting, and there was very great tension with one group led by the then chairman of the SPLM, and late John Garang, and the president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir. And the charge by Salva and his people against John Garang was that he was treating the movement, the SPLM, as his personal property. Even where the organization would meet and elect committees to do whatever, what John Garang would do is to create parallel structures so that your official structures are immobilized, so that John Garang personally controls his whole outfit. That was one of the accusations, big crisis in the organization. Another one was that there was no regard for the lives of the ordinary people. You have a leadership which sees the people merely as instruments for the leaders to achieve whatever it is they want. It doesn't matter how many people die and all this, provided this leader, get this particular outcome. Another accusation is a very strange one, that we are talking about December 2004, that the level of corruption that had set in among this leadership of the SPLM was very deep. And one of the things that Salva Kiir says in those minutes is that you've got people among us who not only own bank accounts in foreign countries, but actually own companies and big business people. Now, this is a strange liberation fighter. who's a big businessman. And so Salva says the level of corruption that's become entrenched among us, I don't know how we're going to wipe it out as we move towards perhaps becoming an independent country. I'm saying there are three issues that are raised. It's December 2004. They then decide that the following month, January 2005, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was going to be signed in Nairobi to end this 40-year war between North and South Sudan. So we can't afford to lose that peace. Let's make peace among ourselves so that we go and sign this document next month and peace comes to South Sudan. So they agree. But the tragedy is that leadership then did not attend to the challenges it had raised at the meeting in Rumbek in December 2004. And it's exactly the same reason, for the same reasons, that the civil war breaks out in South Sudan in 2013. It's exactly the same. Because they did not attend to the challenges which they raised in 2004 among themselves. The only person, major person who's missing in 2013 is John Garang, because unfortunately passed away in 2005. But the rest are exactly the same. It's the same people who met in 2004, quarreled among themselves, identified what the problems were quite correctly. The same people who quarreled in 2013 for the same reasons as in 2004. Now that raises this question about quality of leadership. Now we can discuss, we don't have the time. What kind of leadership is this which emerged out of that conflict in Sudan? I mean, what kind of liberation fighter is this? And I've never heard of a liberation fighter who owns a foreign bank and a company. But this is what had happened to the South Sudanese leadership.
Who bears the responsibility to therefore impose upon African leaders or states that they must follow through, especially when it comes to crises of these kinds? Follow through on the leadership, the changes, the strategy, the structures that need to be created. If you were asked, what do African businesses need to thrive today? What are the three things that you would highlight as most critical?
The three very huge challenges that I see in the way of the development of the thriving private sector in Africa are the following. First, a stable and incentive-creating macroeconomic environment. There can be no substitute for that. That is one. A macroeconomic environment that provides incentives for savings, for investment, makes it possible for businessmen to plan and the development of their businesses, and especially makes it possible for them to access a mix of appropriate financing from commercial banks, longer-term finance from development banks, and sovereign funds, and the like. That is very important. The next one is infrastructure, especially power. I met a businessman in Accra recently who was in the business of steel. I was very encouraged. I said, steel? That's interesting in Ghana. How are you doing? He said, very well. Now, we in Ghana, like many African countries, have been going through huge challenges of reliable and stable electricity. So I asked him, how are you dealing with these outages and constant outages and so on. And then he paused a while, and I said what I feared he was going to say, namely that I've invested a great deal of money in huge generators. And I said, well, what is that doing for your competitiveness? And obviously, it was a huge challenge for him. I think it's well known that Africa has a huge gap in infrastructure development. And of all this, I think power is hugely important. So the second challenge really is power, is infrastructure generally, but especially power. Now, the third one is policy implementation, consistent, dogged policy implementation, and not broken by the vicissitudes of political transition. One government comes, I don't like what the other guys were doing, I'll chart a new course. And worse, they hound businessmen who they think were affiliated or aligned with the previous government. There are many instances where a new government comes to power and businessmen flee the country, go and live abroad, and wait for the parties with whom they were associated or perceived to be associated to come back to power. So we need consistent, dogged implementation of the right policies. In many African countries today, the policies are there because they've been debated over and over again, and private sector development policies are well known, but they are not implemented consistently, and they are often broken by what I call the vicissitudes of political transition. If you are not driven by a vision and a determination to lift yourself, the people, obviously you'll be looking for all the wrong things. And part of the problem in South Sudan, if the people, the leaders, were driven by this sentiment, the love, the patriotism, but if you're driven by a vision that identifies the common ground that all of them need to be seeking, they probably will be united.
President Chisano, I come to you now. And in your mind, looking at the continent today, what must we do to ensure that we are able to create businesses that thrive rather than environments of conflict?
For most of the questions which we are talking about here, we must link them with the word knowledge. We have many resources to develop, and one of the resources is land. In Mozambique, when we became independent, we said that the basis of our development must be agriculture, which means is land. But land in Mozambique did not belong to the people. It belonged to foreigners, so the settlers. And that's why we nationalized the land after 1 month of our existence as an independent country, because we knew the value of land. But I said knowledge is crucial, because one has got land, but has to know, to have the knowledge in order to develop that land. Even in terms of agriculture, the forestry, how do you use the forests? Because the forests grow on the land. Even the game parks, because the animals live on the land, you need knowledge. But in Mozambique, where at independence we didn't have a shop owner to sell needles or soap, we see that our business community is just being born. And this requires a lot of things. including in the utilization of land. We have a vast land resources in Mozambique. We can feed Southern Africa if we had the knowledge, the technology, and of course the finance. We are speaking about raising our own finance internally, but countries like Mozambique need time. Although this is also our view, that we have to, first of all, think about ourselves, love ourselves, but it's not only the leaders, but also the people. They must learn how to love themselves.
When it comes to use of land and the extractive industries, what critical lessons have we learned moving forward?
It is an extractive industry, as you are saying. I mean, the resources. So the more you dig, the more you deplete. But whilst it is sitting on the ground, it has no serious value. You create value by spending money, by pushing it up the value curve. So there are risks that are involved and lots of uncertainty that is there. But if you want to utilize it, you can utilize it today, because tomorrow you don't know what's going to be there. And we could sit on top of these things and they become useless at some point. So in my view, I think it is important that we do that. But at the end of the day, really, it's all about us taking our rightful places and being led. There must be someone in any situation, in any country. The 80-20 rule sometimes work, where it's not the 80% that drives growth and development, but it's just a small group of people who instill confidence, conscientize, and do all sorts of things. But it is a challenge that President Chisana is raising. Without the resources, you cannot develop any country.
After the break, the conversation turns to opening borders to trade, encouraging women-run businesses and SMEs, and the responsibilities of the public and private sectors to grow African economies.
Franny, with that, I still want to talk about opening up borders. So I'll come to you with that, Franny. You know, you've been involved in the space of building women's businesses, and we know the impact that women are having, but at micro level. And the challenge that we have is to scale these businesses up so that they are having significant impact. Part of that is enabling cross-border trade to happen. In many of our countries, they struggle to get across borders, and the greatest opportunities lie in offering this to a lot of these women. Finance, first of all, capacity to scale up, but also access to different markets. Are things changing? And perhaps it's not just a question on women's businesses, it's micro and small and medium-sized businesses across this continent. How do we empower them?
There are a number of things that need to be in place for small and medium enterprises to succeed, and also for those companies to then grow, to become the giants around the world, because most companies started small, just like people. They are born babies and then they grow. There are a number of things that need to be in place, and I'll focus on what we call at the African Development Bank the high fives, because those are the key enablers that help small companies, women-owned companies, inclusive businesses, but also bigger businesses to grow and to succeed. And the first of that is energy. We have a strategy at the African Development Bank to light up and power Africa, because when you travel around any African country and you look at the small and medium enterprises, women-owned businesses, their power is battery operated, it's wood and the pollution that comes along with that, or they are using very expensive generation for those that are able to go to the first stage of production. So providing power, lighting up households so that the woman who's making dresses for export can have electricity while she works on her designs. But so would the industry that is processing food into a product that can be moved across countries can have the same access to electricity, and of course the mining companies that are very heavily dependent on energy. So energy is the first one. The second one, and this comes to a very fundamental aspect, is how we transform agriculture into a business. And the priority we have at the African Development Bank is Feed Africa, because we believe that when you invest in transforming agriculture into a business, you make the land valuable, you use it for a valuable purpose. You also are able to preserve your production for future use, and you are able to transact in trade. And when you look today, most cross-border trade is around food. So Tanzania grows maize, sends it to Kenya, it gets processed into flour, put into bags and sold back to Tanzania. Right? So this is an example of trade that's going on. But value-adding trade, if there was electricity in Tanzania to run the mills, to manufacture paper bags, to put the flour in those bags, sell it internally, that would be value-adding as well. And maybe then you can sell cakes made out of cornmeal to Kenya instead of selling corn or maize. So these are some of the examples where feeding and industrializing are correlated. The third key high five is industrializing Africa, and that one is very, very transformational. We just had our board approve the strategy to industrialize Africa. And one of the statements in that strategy said, Africa's growth will be led by the private sector, but for that to happen, it has to be enabled by the public sector. Because 90% of job creation in Africa is through the private sector, and therefore transformation of Africa would need to be supported and led by the private sector, but the public sector has a critical role. But in order to industrialize Africa, we need knowledge and skills. We need to invest in research and development, and I have a few examples which really are going very well when you look across the continent. You look at Arusha, Abuja, and Ouagadougou, where we have the Nelson Mandela Institutes of Science and Technology. They are generating scientists and engineers who get employed even before they graduate. The one in Arusha, in less than 5 years, had 129 scientific publications in international journals and had already patents in the areas of water and other technologies. So we can move very quickly through this role of building skills, investing in R&D, and focusing on science and technology that can transform our industries and actually create new industries. The example in Arusha and Abuja, they're looking, for example, at how you can package products that don't need refrigeration. Because as you fix the energy problem, perhaps you can fix the food production problem in a way that you don't need electricity. So thinking differently because of the conditions we have on the ground. The fourth critical area which comes to your question is integrating Africa. Here we have a lot of work to do, but we've made a lot of progress. In a few months, a small segment of road between Iringa and Dodoma will be completed, and that would allow us to drive on a tarmac road from Cape Town to Cairo. This is an amazing transformation that has taken place in a small amount of time, and I'm very proud to say that I participate in this in two ways. First, by being a Tanzanian, where we have contributed to that segment. It's the last miles, not 1 mile, 270 kilometers of road that needs to be fixed, but also as the African Development Bank, which has financed 45% of our portfolio goes into the road sector. So a lot of these roads that have been built across Africa have been financed by the African Development Bank. But in addition to roads, it's integrating capital markets. We had only 5 capital markets in the 1980s. Today we have 20. And we are working on instruments to integrate these capital markets. So you have the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, Nairobi, Nigeria Stock Exchange coming together with Casablanca and others in order to build an African capital market space that provides the financing needed by these companies. Because one of the critical constraints is lack of finance. Interest rates are very high. Companies need to have access to finance. Private equity, what I was doing before going to the ADB, very important. A lot of our companies cannot get off the ground if they don't get that important investment that allows them to get off the ground. The last area is raising the quality of life of Africans, because if you are not healthy and not educated, and I have access to good education, if you cannot get a job, you cannot contribute to the transformation of Africa. So raising the quality of life of Africans is a very critical investment.
We should say thanks a lot to President Kapa for raising this issue. Centrally, the matter that our keynote speaker was addressing, the role and place and so on of the private sector with regard to African development and so on. The matter you are raising about cross-border and all that is relevant to it, it's true. But I'm answering his question, you didn't ask it. But you see, this is a very important question. I think we need to come back to it, specifically in the way that it was phrased and posed. For instance, I'll give you 2-3 quick examples of the challenge. Towards the end of last year, I attended the 43rd Annual General Meeting of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. And there were all of these manufacturing companies of Nigeria, many of them. And they've sustained this association of theirs now for more than 4 decades. And the critical problem with manufacturing in Nigeria is infrastructure. So you have these manufacturing organizations who say, the government has failed to produce electricity. So you want to run a business, you must buy a generator. The government has failed to build roads. I produce something in my factory, I need to take it somewhere to the market, I have to battle. And you listen to this story, it is a tragic story. So we all talk about the role of the private sector in Nigeria to help in the modernization, industrialization of Nigeria is going to fail. Not because of absence of will on the part of this private sector, not even hostility, but certain failures in Nigerian governance, which have persisted for many years, many decades. I do not know if that's a general African problem, but it's certainly a Nigerian problem. So if we're talking about the role of the private sector in the way that the question was posed, clearly this is one of the matters that we would look at. It's not just the absence of the infrastructure, but what is it that causes the absence of that infrastructure? So that becomes a challenge. It's a challenge of governance. Or you have something that Sipho did not speak about. South African private sector. There's a particular feature of that private sector, which is, I'm talking about the bulk of the South African private sector from the point of view of capital and so on, which is white. From '94, that white capital has been very skeptical about the future of South Africa. Uncertain. We are in an African country, never mind how smooth this transition was. But because we're an African country, there's bound to be disaster tomorrow. And therefore, I can't invest all my money. Because in the end, I'll have to run. I know that for a fact. And I can't take away a factory and run with it, but cash I can. So levels of liquidity maintained by the South African private sector, way above what is normal globally. And people are asking this question, why are these levels of high liquidity? People are not investing this money, they are keeping it in banks. Why? So, because it's foreigners who are asking us this question, we get embarrassed. It's just plain racism. We don't trust this black government. There's bound to be a disaster tomorrow. So I need to have enough in my pocket to run away. It's a problem in South Africa even today. The private sector is bleeding the continent. Huge volumes of capital are leaving the continent illicitly. And part of the problem is with us. You go to oil-producing countries on the continent. I'm talking about practical things. We wander around the continent and say to an oil-producing country, how much oil are you producing and exporting? And they'd give you some figures. And you say, how do you know? No, that's what the oil companies have reported. One president says, after we'd had the formal meeting and as we were walking out, he says, but let me tell you what's happening. We are convinced that the oil companies are underreporting levels of production and export by a third, 33%. Or you take Guinea, Conakry, is a major exporter of diamonds. It is not a major producer of diamonds, but it's a big exporter of diamonds. So if you look at what is declared in Guinea in terms of diamonds that were exported, particularly to Dubai, you'll find, for instance, $250 million, $250 million worth of diamonds were exported from Guinea. And you find that when those diamonds are resold, exported to Dubai, when they are resold in Dubai, they are $1 billion, which 750 million is then exported illegally out of the continent. As an old friend of mine in Tanzania here, who told me a story about Tanzanite here, that at a certain point, what was appearing in terms of the government records was exports of Tanzanite, annual exports of $8 million. But the global figures, trade in Tanzanite, were 500 million. The private sector, in whatever form it was, whether it was formal or informal, was smuggling Tanzanite out of Tanzania. Now, I'm saying these are the challenges of the private sector. I think it requires a proper focus on this matter, a more detailed look at this question, perhaps even country by country. And I think that maybe one of the things that ought to come out of here, even if it's the Institute, Uongozi, to follow up on this matter, because I think the specific lessons, practical ones, that we would learn from country to country would help in terms of addressing this issue in the manner that the question was posed.
With that, Kwesi, let me come to you. We're talking about creating an environment of trust where each party plays its role. Following on from the comments made by President Mbeki, what are your thoughts on how we move forward with trying to correct what is clearly a dishonest relationship, possibly on both sides, government not giving enough and creating the enabling environment that's required? I won't even go into the corruption issues, which you can go into more detail that need to be dealt with, alongside a corrupt private sector in some instances, which is not also then playing its role.
First of all, I'd like to associate myself entirely with what President Mbeki just said. And by the way, when I talked about culture, I meant more the attitude that we have to businessmen, and not some culture that's innate in us as Africans. The good old Lord didn't quite put that in us, I think. But we must develop the right relationship and create the trust between the public and the private sector. In creating the right policy environment, that provides the incentive framework for the private sector to thrive. So it is important to recognize that the primacy of the role of the private sector in setting the pace and so on, and increasing the right environment. The private sector has its own problems in our countries. If you have a private sector that is led or defined by a good proportion of businessmen who don't pay taxes, don't provide any support to community development and so on, obviously it is not employment, it's not growth creating, because revenues don't thrive, and that has implications for even the stability of the macroeconomic environment. On the other hand, if the state, in setting policies, creates conditions for corruption, that's a problem. Obviously, if you set taxes that, or levies and tariffs and so on that are prohibitive, well, people will find a way of evading them. So let's speak to the integrity and good sense of public sector policy making and enforcement of the laws. Even in the area of the integration that we're talking about, the free movement of people. You're right, yes, we need to be cautious with all the talk of terrorism and the incidents of terrorism. Our states are fragile and so on. But there's a great deal to be gained by the enforcement of the agreements we have reached already. You rightly pointed out that it is more difficult to get visas to many African countries than it is to get visas to Europe. We say we passed laws and signed regional agreements and the like that make for the free movement of persons. But if you were traveling from Accra to Abidjan, for instance, you would meet with just so many obstacles that are illegal, most of them, and so on. So at least we can start with implementing the agreements that we have reached to make for the free movement of persons. The incidents of the terrorism and the insecurities that we feel, well, mercifully, they're not really as huge in our region as they are in other regions. And so we shouldn't use these as a pretext, at the very least, for not implementing the agreements we have reached. And finally, you just a word or two about the small and medium-scale enterprises. This is where employment is created. This is the nursing ground for huge, globally competitive businesses. The academic theory has said all that needs to be said about the problems of SMEs, the problems of financing, what can be done, and so on. But half the time, the problem is that institutions for private sector development in our countries are not well coordinated. You see ministries fighting one another. The responsibility for private sector development resides in the Ministry of Trade, in the Ministry of Industry, in the President's office, and so on, often without very much coordination. And you see ministries fighting over turf, okay, instead of really participating in a coherent program that is really meant to enhance private sector development.
President Chissano and CFO, I come to you both for a quick one. President Chissano, if you're in a room with private sector and you got a chance to advise the African private sector on what government requires from them, what would you say to them?
It's necessary to create, as he said, a trust first, to facilitate dialogue between the business and the public sector, the business with the government. So the government, before asking things to the private sector to do, must also question whether they are proposing to the private sector very feasible things. Pay taxes of what, from which money they are going to pay these taxes, to create so many taxes because you need money. But how they start their business without any incentive. But one thing which we should tell the businesses that they must be honest. We have to look into our environment, our specificities in Africa, and we are different. Here, as we are talking Nigeria and maybe Senegal and South Africa, they can speak a language. But Tanzania and Mozambique and the others have to speak, they speak a different language. We have to be careful when we demand things from the private sector. We must be sure that we are demanding things which they can fulfill by analyzing what is the situation of our private sector in a given time in our countries.
You've just given us a fantastic keynote address this morning. If you were giving that keynote to heads of state at the African Union and you had a parting shot, a final sentence to deliver for maximum impact, what would that sentence be?
I would say we in our own countries are looking to you as our leaders. Lead us well. I think it's very important that you lead us well. It's important that you motivate us. It's important that you give us guidance and direction, because whatever you, in a large way, you advise us to do, we are likely to do and follow that one. But if you come to us and say, well, Sipo, I mean, like someone, you know what, do this and open an account for me in a certain place, you're starting to introduce another concept which others may embrace, others may not. So as you lead me, let me not corrupt you, and you must not corrupt me. And whatever we do it for the benefit of ourselves and our people, because we put people first.
The last comment went to Franny Leotier from the African Development Bank.
The last comment I wanted to make is on the issues that have been raised around love. And there are only three concepts in economics that are infinite. The first one is love. Love is infinite. The love of a mother for a child, a patriot for their country, a founder of a company for their company. Those elements of love are infinite, which means you'll put whatever it takes for them to succeed. And I think this is very important as an aspect of leadership, so we can move with that concept. I thank Sipo for bringing it up. But the second one is knowledge, and President Chisano raised. Knowledge is infinite, and linked to knowledge is learning, which is also infinite. So if we can use knowledge and learning and have our leaders push for learning and knowledge, I think it would be critical for success. But the third one is creativity. It's also infinite, and creativity leads to innovation. So I think these three infinite concepts can lead us ahead as we meander through this very complex world of leading to enable African businesses to transform the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and what a brilliant way to end our first session. Love, knowledge and learning, and creativity.